The Burton estate stood like a portrait of grace, its facade washed in pale stone, its gardens lined with roses that seemed to bloom longer than nature allowed. To every visitor it was a house of wealth and dignity, a home where noble blood carried itself with charm, where laughter echoed through high halls, and where children were born with blessings whispered by priests. But beneath that charm was something else, a quiet rhythm of tragedy, one so regular it could not be coincidence. Every child who entered this world beneath the Burton roof was destined to die, and each time they did, the next child was named after the one before, as if the family believed they could trap a soul in repetition. Their guests saw smiles, but the walls were lined with shadows deeper than any candle could chase away. The tradition began, or so records suggest, with Lord Richard Burton, a man praised at court for his devotion to King Charles and remembered for his generosity toward physicians and scholars. Outwardly, he played the part of a grieving father, mourning each child as they withered, while his wife Eleanor clung to rosary beads and whispered prayers in public. Yet servants whispered of the private halls where mourning had no place. In the nursery, portraits were repainted endlessly, each child's face overlaid with another, so that the same name, the same painted smile appeared again and again as though frozen in time. Each birth was treated not as a gift, but as a continuation of an experiment, another vessel into which the family poured both faith and fear. Neighbors pitied them, saying their family was cursed. But curses do not arrange bones so neatly, nor do they time each death with the patience of a scientist. The first child, young Richard, was found pale in his crib, lips blue, his small hands stiff as if frozen. His mother spoke of sudden illness, yet the midwife remembered the room being colder than the rest of the house, as though the air itself had been drained of warmth. When the second Richard was born, the midwife noticed the odd weight of silence in the room. The family smiled, but it was not joy. It was a grim satisfaction, like a circle closing. That boy, too, died not with fever or plague, but in a copper basin filled with icy water, his tiny chest rising slower and slower until it ceased. Eleanor later told her closest servant that the water was not meant to kill, but to renew. She said the body must be tested by the elements, so that the one who came after might be stronger. The deaths multiplied with years, and always the names repeated. Richard, Eleanor, Thomas, Anne, each time the same, each name echoing the one before, like a bell tolling endlessly through generations. What looked like grief from the outside was ritual within. At funerals, the family wore white rather than black, claiming it was a symbol of purity, though the villagers who watched from afar muttered that it was more like mockery. They buried the children not in scattered plots, but in a perfect line, each tiny coffin the same size, each name carved identically into stone. In that soil lay not only innocence lost, but order. The kind of order that comes only when death itself is organized, recorded, and carried forward like a ledger that must always be balanced. It was not only the children who suffered. Servants spoke of nights when cries carried through the walls, the kind of cries that stretched thin with desperation, then stopped abruptly as though cut off by force. Some said Lady Eleanor entered the nursery with bowls of herbs and oils, holding them to the infants' mouths until they inhaled fumes that quieted them permanently. Others said Lord Richard tested the strength of circulation by binding the small arms until blood no longer flowed, watching the way skin drained of life as though he could measure death itself. The servants who stayed long enough to witness these moments either fled in silence or vanished themselves. Their names erased from records, their belongings burned as if they had never lived at all. Still the house smiled. It smiled in its gardens, in its painted halls, in the calm faces of its masters. It smiled in the way tragedy was spoken of with politeness, as if misfortune had simply chosen the Burtons too many times. But behind the calm was the truth. The Burtons were not chosen by tragedy. They chose tragedy themselves, and they did so methodically, repeating death as one repeats a prayer, binding the name of each lost child to the next as though the family believed that identity could be harvested and replanted. This was no curse. It was devotion to a ritual they refused to end. By the time the estate became infamous in whispers, no one could remember how many Richards or Annes had been buried. The family chapel was heavy with plaques, each repeating the same names until they blurred into one. Priests blessed the graves without protest, grateful for the donations the Burtons gave to the church. Visitors felt sorrow but not suspicion, for the house seemed too grand, too noble, too holy to conceal wickedness. Yet the ground beneath their feet was layered with bones, and every smiling portrait in the halls was painted over the memory of another lost child. The house became a stage where innocence was paraded in daylight and executed in silence by night. Each child entered the world already carrying the shadow of the one before, already bound by a ritual that demanded suffering. And as each coffin lowered into the earth, the Burtons smiled with patience, waiting for the next child, the next experiment, the next repetition. The house did not weep, it only smiled, and in that smile lay the first sign that something far more methodical, far more monstrous was unfolding behind its noble walls. And so the foundation of the Burton legacy was laid, not in bloodline or honor, but in death repeated like scripture. With each burial, the family tightened its grip on its own madness, and with each christening, they opened the door again to the ritual cycle. As the century deepened, this pattern would grow, its cruelty masked as grief, its method hidden behind prayer. But soon, the world outside would begin to take notice, and the smiling house would no longer be able to hide what it carried within. The Burton family's secret cruelty would never have survived without the shield of respectability they wore like armor. In 17th century England, influence meant survival, and Lord Richard Burton knew how to weave himself into the fabric of power. He was seen in the company of King Charles I's loyalists, offering coin for the royal cause. His name whispered in courtly circles as a man of loyalty and learning. To the public eye, he was a patron of medicine and science, inviting doctors, clerics, and scholars into his home. His estate became known as a gathering place for conversation on philosophy, anatomy, and the mysteries of the natural world. Behind velvet curtains, however, these same gatherings offered cover for darker pursuits. What others believed to be debates on the soul and the body were preludes to experiments that stripped both of their dignity. One guest who visited the Burton estate more than once was Dr. William Harvey, the king's physician, whose discoveries about the circulation of blood would shape medicine for centuries. To Harvey, the Burtons seemed eager disciples fascinated by his teachings. Lord Richard praised Harvey's lectures, nodding with rapt attention as the physician explained the heart's pumping power and the endless circuit of blood through veins and arteries. Eleanor Burton listened too, though her gaze lingered not on the doctor's words but on the children who sat obediently in the corner. Their small arms visible, their veins like pale blue threads beneath the skin. For her, Harvey's science was not abstract. It was an invitation. When the physician left the estate, honored and unsuspecting, the Burtons returned to their private chambers, where his words became instructions for new rituals. The servants soon learned to fear the times when scholars visited. Every lecture meant another child would be taken to the hidden rooms beneath the estate, where oil lamps burned and shadows danced across the walls. There Lord Richard mimicked Harvey's demonstrations, binding the limbs of infants with strips of linen, pressing his ear to their tiny chests to hear the fading heartbeat. Eleanor carried bowls of blood into the chapel, smearing it across the altar while whispering that she was purifying their name for God. They told themselves that each sacrifice was a step toward understanding the mystery of life itself, that science and faith were not at odds but joined in their hands. The horror was not only in the acts but in the patience with which they were carried out. A child might be weakened slowly over days, its blood drained in increments so small that it lingered in half-life, neither dead nor fully alive. The Burtons recorded every moment, scratching notes into leather-bound journals. How long the heart continued after the first cut, how long after the second, how color drained from lips when breath faltered. These records were written in the same careful script used for estate accounts and church donations, as if the spilling of blood belonged to the same order of daily business. And yet, to the outer world, the Burtons were admired. They gave money to struggling parishes, paid the dowries of impoverished girls, and hosted feasts where nobles dined beneath portraits of smiling children who, in truth, were already dead. The family was spoken of with sympathy, for everyone knew of their repeated losses. Some said their house was cursed by God, yet others admired their steadfastness, believing the endless baptisms and burials were proof of unshakable faith. What none dared imagine was that these tragedies were staged, crafted not by fate but by hands that carried out cruelty with deliberate calculation. Influence kept suspicion at bay. Priests who raised concerns found themselves silenced with generous gifts. Clerks who hinted at irregularities in burial records were promoted to new posts far from the estate. When whispers grew too loud, the Burtons donated to hospitals in London, their names etched in marble plaques for charity. Their reputation glowed so brightly in public that the darkness of their private rituals remained invisible. Power protected them, and in return they continued to feed their power with death. By the 1640s, when England was descending into civil war, the Burtons grew even bolder. The turmoil outside the estate offered them freedom inside it. Soldiers marched across fields, towns were split by loyalty to crown or parliament, and people were too consumed with survival to question what happened in a noble household. Amid the chaos, Eleanor Burton devised new rituals. She pressed needles into the tender skin of infants, not to heal but to mark the vessels of sin. She opened veins with surgical knives stolen from traveling doctors and collected the blood in glass vials, arranging them on shelves as if curating relics. Each vial bore a child's name, written not in ink but in ash mixed with tears. To those who entered the estate for courtly gatherings, none of this was visible. They saw only rich tapestries, tables of fruit, and hosts who grieved with dignified restraint. Yet even they felt an unease they could not name. Guests sometimes remarked that the air of the house seemed heavy, that the walls themselves seemed to listen. Some swore they heard the echo of children's cries carried through stone corridors, muffled as though from beneath the floor. But they dismissed these feelings, telling themselves it was their own imagination, for how could such noble patrons of church and science harbor anything but sorrow? The truth was that the Burtons' sorrow was staged, their respectability a mask. Their true face was only visible in the chamber below, where children lay silent and bound, their small bodies used as instruments for experiments disguised as devotion. And so the family continued year after year, feeding on tragedy while their names remained honored in the halls of the powerful. The house that smiled in Chapter 1 now revealed the shadow behind its grin. Influence so carefully cultivated that even the most respected men of the age could not see the darkness staring back at them. In the outside world, people whispered that the Burtons were cursed, that heaven had turned its face from the family and struck down every child born under their roof. But within the estate, where prayers were muttered in shadows and cries echoed down narrow halls, the truth was far more deliberate. Lady Eleanor Burton did not see her children as victims of divine wrath. She saw them as vessels, each born to carry a burden, each meant to serve as a stepping stone towards something greater. She spoke often of renewal, telling her closest servants that each death was not an end, but a refinement, a sacrifice that cleansed the family bloodline and prepared the way for a perfect heir. What others mistook for grief was, to her, ritual triumph. The doctrine of renewal was not written in books nor preached in churches. It was built slowly, brick by brick, through Eleanor's mind, shaped by her grief and her obsession with order. Every child was baptized not in holy water, but in water mixed with salt and ash, a concoction she whispered would preserve the spirit. When the child inevitably died, she would insist the body not be buried immediately. Instead, she and Richard would conduct what they called tests. The infants were bled, but not with frenzy. It was precise, measured, each cut small enough to allow life to linger, each moment stretched so that death arrived as a slow surrender rather than sudden release. One of Eleanor's most chilling rituals involved submerging infants into troughs of water kept at varying temperatures. Some were plunged into freezing basins, their lips quivering blue as their tiny lungs fought to hold breath. Others were lowered into scalding baths, their skin blistering as Eleanor murmured that heat would drive out weakness. She wrote in her hidden journals that these trials would teach her which element, ice or fire, could purify the soul. Each experiment was carried out with terrifying calm, as though she were handling scripture rather than flesh. Servants who were forced to assist reported her whispering that the child would return stronger in the next birth. The cycle of death became almost liturgical. A child would be born, christened with the name of the one who came before, and then gradually subjected to weeks of ordeals. Their bodies were starved of warmth, of air, of blood. They were bound and measured, their cries, recorded in the pages of Eleanor's notebooks as though they were notes in a symphony. When death finally came, it was marked with ritual precision. The body would be carried to the family chapel, laid upon the altar beneath flickering candles. Eleanor would smear its blood across the walls, claiming that each stain sealed the house against divine judgment. Then only after prayers were whispered and relics placed upon the tiny corpse would the coffin be prepared. Lord Richard justified it all with a different logic. To him, the deaths were acts of science. He called it progress, echoing the words of Harvey and Boyle, the great men of knowledge he so admired. He told himself that their discoveries could only be advanced by sacrifice, and that if lambs and pigs could be dissected for knowledge, then surely his own bloodline was a nobler offering. His journals read like clinical reports, filled with observations on heart rates, lung capacity, and the speed of decay. Yet even in his records there was a hidden language, one that betrayed a darker obsession, the belief that the essence of each child lingered, and that by naming the next child after the last, he could capture that essence and continue the experiment without end. The villagers surrounding the estate saw only fragments of this madness. They witnessed endless funerals, tiny coffins carried into consecrated ground. The family dressed in pale garments instead of mourning black. Some whispered that the Burtons were saints, enduring more sorrow than any family should, and yet continuing to serve the crown and the church. Others muttered that no family could suffer such repeated loss without having earned it, and that perhaps Eleanor's obsession with relics and rituals had invited a curse. But no one spoke too loudly, for the Burtons held wealth and influence, and in those years power was often proof of innocence. The truth was that no curse drove the cycle. It was devotion. Devotion to a doctrine born from Eleanor's madness and Richard's cold curiosity. Together they convinced themselves that they were crafting a lineage of purity, that each lost child was a necessary offering, each ritual a step closer to eternal strength. Their minds twisted grief into purpose, cruelty into necessity, until the line between murder and salvation no longer existed. In the hidden chapel above the row of small coffins, Eleanor hung a tapestry embroidered with a single phrase: "Through death, we are reborn." It was not scripture from any Bible. It was her own invention, the creed of a family that worshipped renewal through destruction. Every candle lit beneath those words illuminated the pale faces of children who never had a chance to live, their names already spoken by another before them, their deaths already written by the hands of those meant to protect them. And so the doctrine grew, passed from whispered prayer to ritual action, cementing itself as the unspoken law of the house. Each birth was no longer celebrated as hope, but anticipated as another step in a cycle that could not be broken. To outsiders, the Burtons appeared cursed, victims of God's wrath. But inside the house, they were executioners of their own design, guardians of a doctrine that promised salvation even as it consumed every soul who bore their name. The fascination with anatomy was sweeping across Europe in the 17th century. In London and Paris, nobles paid coin to sit in galleries where human bodies were opened before their eyes, organs held aloft like relics, and the mysteries of flesh explained by candlelight. For the Burtons, these theaters were not enough. They desired their own private stage hidden deep within their estate, where no law or moral boundary could limit the reach of their curiosity. What they built was not a chamber of science, but a shrine of desecration. The room smelled of wax and iron, its walls lined with shelves of glass jars, each holding fragments of children who once bore the family name. Hearts floated in amber liquid, small bones dangled on hooks like ornaments, and blood congealed in bowls left as though for communion. It began with Richard Burton's insistence that Harvey's discovery of circulation could be made visible. He claimed that in order to truly understand the soul's vessel, one must open it while the body still clung to life. Infants were placed upon wooden tables, their skins stretched thin beneath sharp blades. Richard traced their veins with knives, following the flow of blood as though mapping a river. He timed each pulse, cutting deeper with every beat, watching the body tremble as life fought to escape. Eleanor, standing beside him, murmured prayers as she caught drops of blood in chalices, calling them offerings for renewal. Together they turned death into performance, their audience not scholars but themselves. Their applause the silence of another heart stilled. The servants who carried the children into that room spoke of sights that haunted them until their final days. One recalled a ribcage cracked open and pulled apart, the tiny bones arranged outward like wings, while Eleanor declared it an angel reborn through sacrifice. Another described how the skin of a stillborn was peeled carefully, then stretched across a wooden frame and painted with oils, transformed into a canvas upon which Eleanor painted saints. Guests who saw these works never guessed their true origin, though some whispered uneasily that the painting's eyes seemed too real, their flesh too lifelike. At the center of the chamber stood what the Burtons called their altar of study. Upon it lay the body of each child when the time came for dissection. The body was never treated as human but as material. They carved and recorded, weighed and measured, their hands steady, their notes written in the same tidy ink used for managing accounts. They believed they were building knowledge, a private scripture of flesh, where every incision revealed a truth hidden from ordinary men. The tragedy was not only in the deaths themselves, but in the cold conviction with which they were turned into spectacle. The room was lit entirely by candlelight, shadows twisting across the walls as the experiments continued through the night. The wax dripped in slow rivulets, falling upon the bodies like false baptism. The flicker of flame made the organs glisten, red and wet, as though still alive. Eleanor's voice carried softly in the darkness, chanting verses she had written herself, verses that bound the act to faith. Through the heart the soul flows, through the vein the curse is drawn. Her words became a litany repeated over every dissection until they no longer sounded like madness but like ritual law. The villagers who lived near the estate sometimes saw strange lights glowing from the windows at night, and some swore they smelled burning flesh carried on the wind. They told stories of spirits trapped inside the house, of angels whose wings had been stolen. Yet these whispers never reached the ears of authority, for the Burtons were generous with their charity. They donated to parish churches, repaired roads, and fed the poor, actions that silenced suspicion. The reality remained hidden, that the bodies of their own children were sacrificed beneath the candles, their remains catalogued like specimens, their names repeated as if memory alone could grant absolution. By the time the Burtons had filled the chamber with jars and bones, their ritual had become second nature. The doctrine of renewal evolved into spectacle, and spectacle into obsession. The dissections were no longer only for knowledge, but for reassurance. Each time a body was opened, Eleanor convinced herself she was closer to understanding why her family suffered so many deaths. Each cut, each display was framed as progress, even as the line of graves grew longer in the chapel yard. The true horror was not the cruelty alone, but the calmness with which it was enacted. Richard wrote meticulous notes on the weight of organs, the thickness of blood, the time it took for rigor mortis to set in. He compared one child to another, recording differences as though compiling a ledger of livestock. Eleanor, meanwhile, turned the remains into art and ritual, blending faith and desecration until the two could not be separated. Their world became one where innocence was raw material, where children were born only to be studied, where grief was masked as enlightenment. The chamber beneath the estate stood as the clearest expression of the Burton mind. Ordered, deliberate, methodical, and yet utterly macabre. In the flicker of candlelight, they believed they were transcending the boundaries of faith and science, walking a path no one else dared. But in truth, they were descending deeper into a pit of cruelty, one that would consume every life born into their family. And as the candles burned lower, and the silence of the dead filled the chamber, the Burtons smiled, convinced that each sacrifice was not an end, but a beginning. What began as whispered devotion in Eleanor's prayers had now become a living theater of death, and the house that smiled in daylight carried within it a chapel of horrors that no guest could ever be allowed to see. The doctrine of renewal had taken flesh, and in candlelight the Burtons' obsession revealed its true face, one that would only grow darker as the years pressed forward. Each christening in the Burton household was staged as if it were a holy day, a grand celebration meant to blind outsiders with pageantry while concealing the horror beneath. The invitations were gilded, the chapel lit with candles, and the priest summoned with generous gifts. Yet beneath the hymns and blessings, the ritual carried a darker weight. For each child was not given a new name, but the name of the one who had just been buried. It was never Richard II or Anne III. It was simply Richard, simply Anne, as though the dead were being reborn in the flesh of the living. To the guests it appeared as grief made tradition. To the family it was the law of their doctrine. Identity itself must be recycled, as if repeating a name might tether a lost soul back into the body of the next child. The feasts that followed these ceremonies were unlike any other. The tables groaned under the weight of food: roasted boar, sugared fruits, wheels of cheese, and jugs of wine. But at the center of every table sat two things that unsettled even the most indulgent guest. First was a slab of raw meat, glistening and red, cut from animals that had not been cooked but only salted. It was presented not to be eaten but as a symbol, a silent offering of flesh. The second was the christening cake, baked white and glazed in red syrup that dripped like blood across its sides. Eleanor insisted that every guest take a slice, that the blood-red sweetness be consumed in honor of the child's new life. Most obeyed, though some looked down as they swallowed. disturbed by the taste that reminded them of iron on the tongue. For the Burtons, the feast was not an indulgence, but a cycle of ritual. Eleanor would lift the first cup of wine and declare that through the death of the last, the life of the next would be made pure. The guests bowed their heads, mistaking her words for poetry born of grief, but in truth they were vows binding the family to their doctrine of renewal. As music played, as dancers filled the hall, the family smiled and entertained, but behind those smiles lay the memory of what awaited the newborn in secret chambers. The feast was not a celebration of life, but the beginning of a countdown to death. The repetition of names created an unsettling continuity, as though the children were not individuals but copies of one another. Portraits hung on the walls showing Richard after Richard, Anne after Anne, their painted faces nearly indistinguishable. Guests sometimes whispered that they could not remember which child was alive and which was dead, that the portraits blurred in memory until all became one. The Burtons encouraged this confusion. They wanted their guests to believe that the line of children was unbroken, that life continued despite death. In reality, the line was broken every time, and each feast was a mask that concealed another small coffin waiting to be filled. The darker side of these feasts was hidden from the guests, but known to the servants who carried the trays and cleaned the remains. After the guests departed, the family returned to the chapel where the feast continued in silence. The leftover meat was cut into smaller pieces and buried in the graves of the children as though feeding them in death. The leftover cake was placed upon the altar, left to rot beneath the gaze of painted saints. Servants recalled how Eleanor would press slices into the mouths of infants who could not yet chew, smearing their faces with red syrup while whispering that they were eating their own legacy. This act blurred the line between nourishment and desecration, between motherly care and ritual cruelty. There were also the deaths that occurred around the feasts, deaths that outsiders tried to dismiss as coincidence. Priests who baptized the children often grew ill and died within weeks, their lungs blackened by sudden infection, their faces pale as though drained of blood. Guests who ate the cake sometimes suffered fevers that lingered, dreams filled with visions of children crying in dark rooms. A nobleman once whispered that he had woken in the night after a feast to find his hands covered in blood that was not his own. He never returned to the estate, yet no one accused the Burtons openly. Their wealth and piety shielded them from suspicion, and their generosity to the church was accepted as proof of innocence. Over time, the cycle became its own spectacle, whispered about in nearby villages. People spoke of the Feast of Names as both blessing and curse, wondering why the family suffered such repetition. Some pitied them, saying the deaths were proof of God's judgment. Others suspected darker forces, whispering that the Burtons were binding souls in unholy rites. But no one dared confront them, for the family's influence was too strong, their charity too valuable, and their reputation too carefully guarded. The feasts continued year after year, each one another link in the chain of ritual cruelty. The guests who attended these ceremonies left with full bellies and uneasy hearts. They remembered the smiles of their hosts, the taste of syrup that clung bitterly on the tongue, the strange silence that lingered after the music ended. Some swore they heard children crying in the distance even as they rode away from the estate, the sound following them across the fields like a shadow. But when they spoke of it later, they dismissed it as imagination, for no one wished to believe that such darkness could exist behind noble walls. And so the Feast of Names became the mask by which the Burtons concealed their horror. It was the face of joy presented to the world, the false celebration that cloaked their doctrine of renewal. Each child was christened not into life but into a cycle of ritual death. Each feast another step in the march toward the chamber below. Beneath the laughter and the music, beneath the cake and the wine, the true purpose remained unchanged: to bind the living to the dead, to erase the line between one child and the next, to carry forward a legacy of cruelty that the world would not see until it was too late. The Burtons wore science like a mask, draping their cruelty in the language of discovery. To the world outside their estate, they were seen as patrons of knowledge, admirers of the new thinkers reshaping England. They praised William Harvey for unlocking the mysteries of the heart, Robert Boyle for unraveling the secrets of air, and other men who dared to dissect the hidden workings of God's creation. But inside their private chambers, the family's devotion to science was not progress. It was a weapon. Every theory became permission, every experiment an excuse to bend life until it broke. Their household became less a home than a laboratory of despair, where the screams of children were drowned by the calm ticking of hourglasses and the steady scratching of pens across paper. Richard Burton admired precision. He believed that knowledge was not in ideas alone, but in the careful timing of life's end. One of his methods involved the suffocation of infants with glass bells, stolen designs modeled after Boyle's vacuum experiments. He placed the bell jars over the children's heads and watched as their small lungs fought for air, as their faces turned from pink to pale to a deep bruised blue. The hourglass was turned with each attempt, the seconds falling like drops of sand into a grave. He measured how long the child could endure, how many heartbeats before silence. To Richard, these deaths were not tragedies but data. He wrote in his ledgers, "The body gives up the soul at predictable intervals." There is order in this, as in all things. Eleanor took the experiments further. She was not content with timing alone. She demanded purification. Inspired by physicians who spoke of cleansing humors with vinegar, she began injecting the acidic liquid directly into her children's veins. Servants described the way the skin blistered and bubbled, the flesh burning from within, the veins blackening as though turning to ash beneath the skin. The children's cries filled the chamber, but Eleanor heard them as hymns. She declared that the acid burned away weakness, that the pain was the body's way of shedding sin. She told herself that if the child died, it was because the soul was unfit. If the child survived longer, it was a sign that the family bloodline had grown purer through suffering. Together they built a gallery of horrors masked as study. They bled children slowly with copper needles, draining the life drop by drop into crystal vessels. They forced them to breathe smoke infused with herbs until their lungs collapsed. They pressed their tiny bodies beneath weights, recording how long the chest could rise before bones cracked under the strain. Each act was carried out with a calmness that chilled the servants who witnessed it, for the Burtons showed no rage, no madness in their eyes. Instead, they moved with the poise of scholars, their cruelty deliberate, their notes tidy and precise. The records themselves became part of the mask. When physicians visited the estate, Richard showed them carefully chosen passages from his journals, sanitized accounts of anatomical study cloaked in respectful language. He omitted the deaths, the screams, the endless coffins. Instead, he presented himself as a nobleman contributing to knowledge, a man of curiosity and discipline. The physicians nodded approvingly, never suspecting that the same ink and paper also recorded the torments of children who bore the family name. What made the Burtons most dangerous was not only their cruelty, but their ability to disguise it as virtue. To the church, they were pious donors. To scholars, they were eager patrons of science. To neighbors, they were a family marked by tragedy yet unbroken in faith. Their reputation was a shield, and behind that shield their experiments multiplied. The villagers may have whispered about the endless funerals, but they also admired the family's learning, their devotion to the king, their charity in hard times. Few dared believe that what was praised as progress could be built upon so much blood. The chamber beneath the estate grew crowded with instruments, glass jars stacked against walls, iron clamps bolted to tables, shelves lined with powders and oils. It was a place where science and superstition blended into one, where the language of medicine became indistinguishable from the language of ritual. Eleanor insisted that prayers be spoken before each experiment, her voice trembling with conviction as she begged God to guide their hands. Richard countered with lectures of circulation and air pressure, his tone as measured as any scholar. Together they forged a doctrine where faith and science did not clash but conspired, where the child's body was both altar and specimen. The children themselves became indistinguishable, each carrying the same name, each enduring the same torments. One Richard was remembered for the way his veins burst beneath vinegar injections, another for the way his heartbeat slowed beneath the bell jar, another for the way his ribs cracked beneath iron weight. Yet in the records they were not separate. They were merged into a single line of study, as though the children were not individuals but chapters in a single book of suffering. The repetition erased their humanity, turning them into fragments of a legacy that grew darker with every page. By the mid-1600s, the Burtons had perfected their mask. Outsiders saw grief, devotion, learning. Insiders saw glass jars fogged with the last breath of children, veins seared with acid, bones broken beneath iron, and names repeated until they lost all meaning. The cruelty did not erupt in fury but flowed with method, disguised by the calmness of science, sanctified by the rhythm of prayer. And so the mask of science became the family's greatest shield. It justified their rituals, protected their reputation, and gave their cruelty the appearance of order. To the world, the Burtons appeared as noble patrons of discovery. But in truth, their discoveries were written not in ink but in the agony of their children, each experiment another nail in the coffin of innocence. The mask would hold for years, protecting them from suspicion, until the shadows began to grow too heavy for even science to conceal. The Burton estate never stood alone. It was bound to the tides of power, and with every shifting wind of England's civil war, new figures passed through its halls. Nobles fleeing the plague in London sought refuge there. Soldiers loyal to both king and parliament alike crossed its fields, and physicians and clerics still came at Richard Burton's invitation, unaware that beneath their feet lay a theater of death. Each visitor left with polite words of gratitude, yet many carried away an unease they could not name, a sense that the smiling house watched them long after they had departed. In 1643, when the war between king and parliament deepened, Oliver Cromwell's men marched through the countryside, seizing homes and demanding loyalty. The Burtons played both sides. To the Royalists, they were faithful servants of Charles I, offering coin and shelter. To Cromwell's agents, they presented themselves as practical and God-fearing, willing to provide supplies for the new order. Their wealth made them untouchable. Their charity kept suspicions at bay. But every night, as muskets echoed in the distance and neighbors chose sides, the Burtons retreated into their private chapel, where the war outside mattered little compared to the war they waged against their own children. The visitors who stayed long enough within the estate often spoke later of strange occurrences. One soldier described hearing faint cries echoing through the stone floors at night, as though children were imprisoned beneath the house. He tried to follow the sound, but every corridor led him back to the same locked door at the base of the chapel. Another noblewoman swore she saw a child standing in the hallway, pale and silent, its lips sewn shut with black thread. When she gasped, the figure vanished into shadow. She left the estate the next morning, refusing ever to return, but she never spoke publicly of what she saw, for the Burtons' influence reached far beyond their walls. Even the clergy were unsettled. A young priest sent to baptize one of the newborn Richards wrote in his diary that the ceremony felt more like a burial than a christening. The family dressed in white, not black, and Eleanor pressed the infant's lips against a chalice of red wine, declaring that the blood of the last would feed the soul of the next. When the priest hesitated, Richard placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and told him that the family's devotion was beyond the understanding of outsiders. Weeks later, the priest was found hanging in his rectory, his final letter hinting at horrors he dared not name. The letter was buried by church authorities, sealed away as slander against noble benefactors. Servants who attempted to escape told darker tales still. One girl fled across the fields at night, barefoot and trembling, her body shaking with fever when she reached the nearest village. She claimed she had seen rows of children bound beneath the chapel, their eyes wide, their mouths sewn closed with coarse thread so their screams would not interrupt the prayers above. She said Eleanor stood over them with a candle, whispering blessings as Richard recorded their muffled cries as data. The girl vanished 2 nights later, her body never recovered. Some villagers believed she drowned in the river. Others whispered that the Burtons had retrieved her, silencing her forever. Despite these shadows, the Burtons continued to host gatherings of power. Soldiers dined in their halls, unaware of the jars of preserved organs in chambers below. Nobles played music in their galleries, not realizing that the canvases upon the walls were painted on the stretched skin of infants who once bore the family name. The guests praised the family's generosity, their resilience in the face of endless tragedy. They admired the rows of plaques in the chapel, each inscribed with the same names repeated again and again, mistaking it for faith instead of ritual. The war made suspicion easy to dismiss. Death was everywhere. Children perished of plague, soldiers fell by the thousands, and families buried loved ones in shallow graves. In such a time, who would question why the Burtons suffered so many funerals? Their endless cycle of births and deaths blended into the greater chaos of the nation, camouflaged by the suffering of an entire kingdom. And yet those who visited often left with a heaviness they could not explain, as though the estate itself clung to them. Some spoke of dreams after leaving, dreams filled with the sound of dripping water and small fists pounding against walls. Some woke with the taste of iron in their mouths, as though they had swallowed blood in their sleep. But none spoke these fears aloud in court. To accuse the Burtons was to accuse benefactors of the king, patrons of scholars, donors to churches. No one wished to risk exile or worse for words that would be dismissed as slander. Silence became the rule, and silence was the Burtons' greatest ally. So long as their reputation gleamed in public, their cruelty could remain cloaked in private. And so the house endured, its halls filled with visitors who smiled politely at the feasts, who praised the family's learning and their faith, while beneath the floors children were bound in darkness, their mouths sewn, their lives measured and extinguished in the name of renewal. The war outside would one day end, kings would rise and fall, but the Burtons' legacy of cruelty continued, untouched by the shifting world beyond their walls. The visitors of the crown came and went, carrying away whispers they dared not share. And with each departure the house smiled again, its secrets intact, its doctrine unbroken. The family's influence stretched like a shadow over England, invisible yet heavy. And in that shadow the cycle of death deepened, preparing for horrors yet to come. The doctrine of renewal reached its darkest hour when Lady Eleanor Burton gave birth to twins. To the outside world it was seen as a blessing, a gift from God to a family burdened with so much loss. Neighbors whispered that perhaps this time the curse would break, that two children born together might survive where so many had not. Bells rang in the village chapel, and the christening was prepared with greater pomp than any before. But within the estate, the birth of twins was not seen as blessing, but as balance. Eleanor believed that two souls born at once meant one must be sacrificed for the other to thrive. The doctrine had never allowed equality. It demanded exchange. The boys were named after the dead once again, two Richards born from the womb together, their fragile cries filling the chamber. Eleanor watched them with a calm that unsettled even Richard himself. She whispered that one belonged to fire, the other to ice, and that their fates would reveal which element purified the bloodline. Preparations were made immediately, the chamber below lit with candles, copper pots set upon flames, troughs filled with water drawn from the frozen earth outside. The servants who carried the infants down the stone steps trembled, knowing what awaited, but obedience was demanded, and disobedience meant silence of another kind. The ritual was conducted with deliberate cruelty. One infant was lowered into a basin of boiling milk, his flesh reddening as he writhed in agony, the scent of scalded skin mingling with the sickly sweetness of dairy. Eleanor's voice carried over his cries, steady and calm, declaring that fire cleansed sin. Richard recorded the time, noting the exact moment the heartbeat faltered. The second twin was buried in ice, his body submerged in freezing water until his lips turned blue and his movements slowed into stillness. Eleanor whispered that cold preserved the soul, that through ice the spirit lingered. Both boys died within hours of birth, their lives extinguished not by fate but by the deliberate hands of their own parents. Their bodies were placed side by side on the family altar, one red and blistered, the other pale and rigid. To Eleanor, this was proof of balance, a demonstration that the cycle of renewal demanded sacrifice in pairs. She raised her hands over them and declared that their souls would merge into the next child, that their suffering was not wasted but woven into the lineage. The household priest forced to witness the ritual broke that night. He hanged himself in the nave, his body swaying above the pews, leaving behind a single note scrawled in desperation. "God has left this house." The note was found, hidden quickly and never spoken of again. But the silence it left was louder than any cry. The collapse of innocence was not only in the deaths of the twins, but in the way the family accepted them without hesitation. The servants did not resist. They cleaned the basins, they washed the bodies, they carried the coffins to the chapel. Their silence was born of terror, their obedience bought by fear, but their compliance sealed the doctrine as law. What might once have been questioned had now become unshakable. No one within the estate dared speak of right or wrong, for morality itself had been rewritten by Eleanor's hand. The graves of the twins were dug side by side in the family plot, 2 more markers carved with the same name. From a distance it looked like devotion, a family enduring tragedy once again. But up close the soil was heavy with repetition, each grave another echo, each name another lie. Visitors came to offer condolences, bringing flowers and prayers. They left speaking of the family's resilience, their steadfastness in faith. None realized that the graves were not symbols of loss but of ritual fulfillment, that the children had not been taken by chance but by design. The collapse of innocence extended beyond the children to the very heir of the estate. The house no longer felt alive even to those who did not know its secrets. Guests spoke of cold drafts that moved without wind, of candle flames that flickered as though disturbed by unseen breaths. Some claimed they heard laughter echoing through corridors at night, laughter that did not belong to the living. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the cries of the twins, releasing them in whispers when the house was quiet. It was as if the estate had swallowed their innocence, digesting it into the stone itself. For Eleanor, the deaths of the twins were not tragedy but triumph. She spoke often of their sacrifice, calling it the purest expression of the doctrine yet. She told Richard that the family was closer than ever to achieving eternal renewal, that the next child would live because the twins had died. She believed that suffering had a mathematics, a balance that could be calculated, and that her children were the numbers she manipulated to reach perfection. Her conviction was so strong that even Richard, who had once thought himself the cold scientist of the family, began to waver. He followed her lead, convinced that her faith gave meaning to his data, that her prayers and his notes together would unlock what neither alone could achieve. But innocence, once lost, cannot be rebuilt. The death of the twins marked a turning point, the moment when the doctrine no longer seemed like tragedy, disguised as devotion, but devotion stripped of all humanity. The family had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. The estate, once a home, was now a tomb where life entered only to be extinguished. And as the graves of the twins settled into the soil, the villagers who passed by at night swore they heard two voices crying in unison, faint but insistent, as though the twins themselves refused to be silenced. The sound carried across the fields, chilling those who heard it. But like all things tied to the Burtons, it was explained away as imagination, as wind, as the restless minds of people too afraid to confront what their hearts already knew. Rumor finally outpaced fear when a gravedigger pried up a damp plank and found a child's coffin lined with quicklime, the bones inside eaten to chalk and arranged too neatly to be chance. The reeve carried the tale to a magistrate, and by the summer of 1662 a hush of law crept toward the Burton estate, quills sharpened and seals hot with wax. Depositions were taken in low rooms that smelled of tallow and wet wool. A midwife spoke of christenings that tasted like iron. A sacristan swore chapel lamps burned on nights without service. A groom, drunk on courage, said he had seen a bell of glass descend over a baby's face like a captured cloud. For the first time, the smiling house felt the drag of judgment. The Burtons did not rage against the tide. They bent it. Richard sent hampers of venison ahead of every interview, coins wrapped in linen, invitations written in a gentleman's hand. Eleanor walked to the rectory with white flowers and reliquaries, pressing a ringed finger to a priest's sleeve and saying grief made neighbors cruel with words. The first complaint vanished when its scribe accepted a tithe post 2 counties away. The second was edited until jealousy read louder than warning. When a parish beadle insisted the graves be opened at once, he was found in a dry well with a broken neck and empty pockets. And the official word was that darkness and drink had chosen him together. An inquest was called at last when a maid hid beneath a stair and watched twins carried from the chamber wrapped in cloth, steaming with milk and crusted with ice. She fled to a manor loyal to Parliament men, and 3 hands sealed her letter with wax the color of a wound. Searchers arrived at dawn, boots thudding, pikes bright, determined to press justice into shape. They crossed the echoing hall and asked for keys. Richard led them past portraits of children whose names repeated like prayers and stopped at a door of iron sunk into chapel stone. He said it held relics and account books. He said the key was lost when the last priest died. He said many things in a voice so calm it made doubt feel impolite. Bodies were raised, yet even the earth worked for the Burtons. Lime had erased what tenderness might have proven. Coffins lay in a perfect line that suggested devotion, not desecration. The surgeon who came with the searchers noted missing organs, yet carved away with skill and clean edges, as if study were the motive rather than malice. Eleanor in white nodded through tears and admitted they had allowed town doctors to learn from loss for the good of England, as any Christian family might do when sorrow becomes teacher. The surgeon pressed his lips thin and wrote a careful phrase, irregular but not criminal, because the law lacked words for a cruelty so tidy. Testimony bent under a weight that was not wind. The midwife recanted after her brother's debts were forgiven. The sacristan remembered that lamps may have been left burning by mistake. The groom confessed he had drunk too deeply and could not swear the bell was not a lantern after all. Only the fleeing maid refused to fold. She said needles carried vinegar into veins. that mouths were sewn with coarse thread, that a priest left a note saying God had gone. The magistrate warned her to mind her tongue when speaking of benefactors, but her hands kept shaking in the same small rhythm as a child's breath failing under glass. The hearing moved to a larger room where wigs and sermons tried to cage the mess. Pamphleteers outside shouted about witches. Scholars inside argued the modern hunger of knowledge. A gentleman cited lectures on circulation and the necessity of specimens. A preacher answered that reason can dress sin and call it progress. The panel asked for one act that proved malice without doubt. Richard offered pages of measurements written in a tidy hand and said sorrow teaches diligence. Eleanor produced a ledger of alms fat with numbers. Bread for widows, coin for repairs, candles for the poor dead of other families. The room leaned toward the comfort of arithmetic because grief set to figures looks like penance. Evidence began to die like cattle in a blight. The letter with 3 seals returned with one snapped and another smeared. A jar that once held a tiny hand reappeared stuffed with rosemary and wax, a balm for prayer. The postwriter who carried the summons toppled under a cart and bit through his tongue, as if even the body had joined the vow of silence. The clerk copying depositions sweated black and drove physicians from his bed, saying no leech would take his blood. By winter, witnesses had moved, sickened, or decided that memory is a door best nailed shut. When findings were written, the panel wrapped ink in caution. The Burtons were admonished for irregular burials, praised for charity, and urged to temper private devotions. No indictment was returned. The phrase set to paper was sorrow ungoverned, as if grief itself had walked the rooms, performed acts, and folded its hands when finished. Outside, the crowd muttered, some relieved, some afraid, all hungry for an answer the law would not give. The maid who had spoken did not return to the village. One rumor said she sailed for the Low Countries. Another said the river kept her beneath a bend where reeds grow thick and forgiving. Soon after, the estate shuttered, wagons leaving by night with chests that clinked and canvases rolled tight, the saints upon them too smooth for linen. The chapel door was barred and the chamber below sealed with fresh stone, while the sexton was kept busy in another parish. Yet lantern light shone behind shutters for days, as if the house refused to admit emptiness. Children in the lane swore they heard a low humming from within, the same lullaby Eleanor used when measuring a heartbeat against sand. The parish book recorded that the Burtons had removed to a northern property for their health. The fields disagreed. The air above them tasted faintly of sweet milk left too long by a hearth, and the chapel floor sweated in winter like skin. The graves remained in their obedient line, the names repeated until meaning thinned to a thread. Thus the trial that never was became their cleanest victory, proof that power can bend just enough to let horror pass in daylight. The house that smiled did not change its expression. It only learned again that silence may be purchased, that order can disguise cruelty, and that method wrapped in respect walks through any court untouched, leaving behind nothing but a careful script of sorrow. Centuries passed, and the Burton estate sank into ruin. Its roof sagged, its gardens withered, and its chapel bells rusted silent. To the casual traveler, it was just another relic of the English countryside, a house too costly to repair and too tainted by rumor to purchase. Yet beneath the ivy and dust, The soil still carried the weight of the children who had been born only to die, their names repeating in stone like a litany no prayer could silence. What the world forgot in daylight, the earth remembered in darkness, and the echoes of these rituals did not remain buried forever. By the 18th century, scholars unsealing parish records stumbled upon anomalies that could not be explained away. Pages of burial registers carried the same names written again and again, each within a year of the other. Midwives' confessions, long hidden in sealed boxes, spoke of strange rites performed with infants, of christenings that resembled funerals. A priest's final letter, once dismissed as madness, was found in the margins of an old Bible, its single sentence, "God has left this house," staring back like a wound. Historians debated whether the Burtons had been victims of hereditary illness, but the fragments of testimony told another story, one too consistent, too deliberate, to be dismissed as chance. The age of enlightenment had no patience for whispers of curses or demons. Yet even the rational minds of reformers admitted that the Burtons had fed their hunger for science with cruelty. The family's journals, unearthed from a hidden chest in the 19th century, revealed careful notes on suffocation, bloodletting, and chemical injection, experiments carried out not on animals or condemned men, but on their own children. The writings read with the tone of scholars, yet every line was steeped in horror. A glass jar recovered from the ruins contained a child's hand preserved in resin. Its tiny fingers curled as if reaching for breath that never came. The past, once veiled in rumor, had stepped into daylight, and the revelations left a scar across the village that surrounded the estate. Laws began to shift in ways that carried the echo of the Burtons' crimes. Child welfare, once ignored, became a matter of public concern. Regulations on burials tightened, requiring inspections, records, and witnesses to prevent irregular interments. Anatomy schools, which had long operated in secrecy, were forced into stricter oversight, their dissections no longer carried out in private chambers but under the eye of law. Each reform was not credited to the Burtons directly, yet those who studied their legacy knew that the horrors whispered in their chapel played a part in shaping boundaries between science and cruelty. The suffering of their children had been transmuted not into salvation as Eleanor once believed, but into cautionary law. The ruins themselves became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Local children dared each other to touch the chapel door at night, claiming to hear faint cries when their palms met the cold stone. Flowers were sometimes left at the graves, though no one confessed to placing them there. In the 19th century, a small memorial was built nearby, dedicated not to the Burtons but to the lost children of unrecorded names. It bore no dates, no faces, only a carved figure of a weeping angel with wings chipped by time. Villagers said it was a gesture of atonement, an admission that the soil beneath their feet was too heavy with sorrow to ignore. In the modern age, the Burton story lingers as a cautionary tale whispered on stormy nights. Historians argue whether Eleanor was a fanatic or a madwoman, whether Richard was a man of science corrupted by obsession or simply a murderer in scholar's clothing. Psychologists point to the doctrine of renewal as an early glimpse into the kind of ideology that would echo centuries later, when regimes and cults masked cruelty with order and dressed murder in the robes of necessity. The Burton estate stands as proof that evil rarely announces itself with rage. More often it moves with calmness, with patience, cloaked in ritual and reason until it becomes indistinguishable from devotion. What lingers most is the silence. Silence that allowed priests to look away, that bought clerks with coin, that let neighbors dismiss cries as imagination. The Burtons thrived not only because of their own cruelty, but because society chose not to confront what lay behind noble doors. The legacy they left is not only in the graves of children, but in the reminder that evil flourishes when clothed in respectability, when cruelty learns to mimic sorrow, when ritual is allowed to hide beneath the mask of science or faith. And so the house remains, though its windows gape empty and its stones crumble into moss. The line of children buried in the chapel yard still runs straight, their names repeating in a rhythm that chills even the most rational mind. Visitors stand at the fence and feel a weight in the air, as if the soil itself resists forgetting. Some swear they hear laughter that does not belong to the living, others the quiet hum of a lullaby carried on the wind. The villagers lock their doors at night, whispering that the Burton cycle is not broken, only waiting. In the end, the Burton legacy is not the pursuit of knowledge or the devotion of faith, but the revelation that evil can live silently, smiling at the world while devouring what it loves most. It shows that cruelty does not need chaos to thrive. It thrives in order, in repetition, in names spoken again and again until meaning is stripped away. It teaches that evil often hides not in the wild places of the world, but in the very homes we believe are sanctuaries. And so the question lingers heavier than any stone set upon their graves. What do we call evil when it is hidden in plain sight? When it prays, when it studies, when it gives charity with one hand and takes life with the other? The Burton story forces us to ask whether such things ended with their ruin, or whether the same shadows live still, behind doors we dare not open, in families we call respectable. What do you think? Could this happen again?